Smoke from a far-off chimney, a child burning with fever, a road swallowed by floodwater, and one young woman standing in a sagging barn doorway, lifting a small gray bird to the gray sky. She let it go. 300 wings thundered up around her like applause. Somewhere across the drowned prairie, a life now depended on whether that bird remembered the way home. Months earlier, before any of that, Marin Vale sat on her trunk outside the Beatrice boarding house with everything she owned and nowhere to put it. The spring of 1889 was slow to warm, and the wind off the prairie carried a chill that no coat could keep out. She pulled her shawl tighter and watched the town go about its business. A wagon rattling past, a dog chasing a hen, a woman hanging wash that snapped in the gusts like small white flags. No one looked at her twice. She was just another young woman with a trunk, and Beatrice had seen plenty of those come and go. "A thing's only worthless," the old landlady had said that morning, pressing a wrapped biscuit into Marin's hands at the door, "until somebody figures out what it's good for." Same with people, same with junk. Don't let folks tell you different. Marin had nodded politely. She did not yet believe a single word of it. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here, we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier, the tales of resilient women, ingenious underdog farmers, and homesteaders who defied mockery and hardship to build thriving legacies from nothing. This is the story of Marin Vale and her pigeons. Stay with me, and I will tell you how a barn full of vermin became the lifeline of an entire settlement. Now picture Marin there on that trunk, a young woman of 24 years with $61 to her name. Her father had been a clockmaker in Ohio, a patient man who taught her that anything could be understood if you watched it long enough and refused to look away. When influenza took both her parents within the same hard winter, she sold the shop, bought a railroad ticket west, and stepped off in Nebraska, because that was where her money stopped carrying her. For 4 months, she had lived in the boarding house and worked at the mercantile, weighing flour and counting nails for Mr. Pruitt, who paid her fairly but reminded her weekly that the position was temporary. When the boarding house was sold to a family from Lincoln, her room went with it. So now she sat on her trunk, biscuit in hand, watching the town decide it had no particular need of her. Beatrice was the kind of settlement that ran on neighbors. 40-some families spread across rolling grassland, connected by rutted roads, and the understanding that when trouble came, you helped. There was a doctor named Hollis 3 miles east, a grist mill on Cub Creek, a supply store at the crossroads, and a one-room school. Everything important sat far apart, stitched together by horses and goodwill and the slow patience of distance. Marin wanted to belong to it. She simply had not found her thread. That afternoon, walking the south road to clear her head, she came upon the old Aldous place, a homestead abandoned 3 years when its owner went back east. The house had caved, but the barn still stood, more or less, a great weathered structure leaning into the wind like a tired animal. A faded sign hung on the fence, "For sale, inquire at bank." She went to the bank. The clerk, a thin man named Mr. Calvin, with spectacles perched on a beak of a nose, looked her up and down. $40, he said, surprised anyone asked. "Land's poor, house is gone, and that barn is about to fall into the creek. Honestly, miss, you would be buying trouble." $40 was most of what she had. It was foolish. It was, by every reasonable measure, the worst use of her savings imaginable. But it was a roof. It was hers. And standing in the bank with $61 and no bed to sleep in, Marin found that owning something, anything, felt better than owning nothing at all. She signed her name. The clerk slid the key across the counter and wished her luck in the particular tone people use when they don't expect it to help. She walked back out the south road at dusk, with the key warm in her fist, rehearsing how she would sweep the place, where she would lay her bedroll, how she would patch the worst of the gaps before nightfall. The barn doors were chained but loose. She fit the key, worked the rusted lock, and hauled the doors open against their own dead weight. The smell hit her first. Warm, dusty, alive. Then the sound, a low, rolling murmur from somewhere above, like water moving over stones. She looked up. The rafters were not empty. They were crowded, every beam and crossbeam lined with shifting gray shapes, hundreds of round eyes catching the last of the light. Pigeons. The entire vaulted ceiling of her new barn was a living, breathing roost, and as she stood frozen in the doorway, 300 birds turned their heads to look down at her. She did not sleep in the barn that first night. She slept in the lean-to against its side, listening to the soft commotion overhead. In the morning she walked into town to ask what on earth she was supposed to do. The answer was unanimous. "Drive them out," said Mr. Pruitt, not looking up from his ledger. "Pigeons foul everything. They will rot your beams, ruin your hay, and breed till you cannot see the floor." "Smoke them out and board up the gaps," offered the blacksmith, a burly man named Gorham. "Burn a sulfur pot under the roost. 2 nights of that they will clear." "Knock the nest down before the eggs hatch," said a farm wife buying thread. "Be ruthless about it, or you will never be rid of them. My cousin let a flock settle and lost a whole loft." Everyone agreed. The birds were filth. The birds were ruin. The birds were the reason that barn had been worthless to begin with. A young woman with no money and no man to help her could not afford to be sentimental about vermin. Marin walked home, turning it over. The sensible thing, the thing every voice in town pressed on her, was to evict them. Smoke, board, sweep. Reclaim her $40 worth of shelter and try to forget the round eyes watching from the dark. But that evening she climbed the ladder to the loft with a lantern, meaning to start knocking down nests, and she stopped. The birds did not panic at her light. A few shuffled, most simply watched. And among the plain gray ones she noticed others. Birds with bright bands of color at their throats, birds with feathered feet, one creamy white bird with a fan of a tail. These weren't only wild rock doves blown in off the prairie. Someone, somewhere, had once kept fancy pigeons. These were the descendants of tame stock gone half wild in an abandoned barn, and they had stayed. That word stuck in her. Stayed. 3 years empty, doors chained, no food set out, and still they came back to these rafters every single night. Her father's voice came to her then, the clockmaker's patience. Anything can be understood if you watch it long enough. She sat on the loft floor a long while, lantern low, and did not knock down a single nest. She did not know yet what they were good for. She only knew that everyone had told her with absolute certainty that the answer was nothing, and her whole life had taught her how often absolute certainty was simply a failure to look closely enough. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. In the morning, she scattered a handful of cracked corn on the threshing floor and watched what came down. And what came down was glorious. The birds descended in a spiraling rush, and she sat motionless among them, learning their manners. Who was bold? Who hung back? Which ones let her near? By week's end, a dozen would feed from her open palm. She wrote to a cousin in Cincinnati who had kept racing pigeons as a boy, asking everything she could think of. While she waited for his reply, she patched the worst of the roof, built rough perches, and gave the tamest birds names. She decided, fully and finally, that she was not going to drive them out. She was going to learn them instead. Every habit, every instinct, every secret of how a creature finds its way home across miles of empty grass. Whatever that knowledge was worth. Her cousin's letter, when it came, was 3 pages long and ended with a name. Find Eider Okafor, lives near Cub Creek Mill. He kept homing birds back in Maryland. He will know more than I do. Eider turned out to be the miller's father, a broad, quiet man in his 60s who had come west with his son. When Marin found him and stammered out her questions, his weathered face cracked into the first real smile she had seen in months. "Homers," he said softly, looking past her toward the south road as if he could see the barn. "Lord, I have not touched a homer in 20 years. Show me." Eider Okafor became her teacher, and the barn became their classroom. He walked the 3 miles from the mill twice a week that spring, and what he knew unfolded slowly, the way good knowledge does. He showed her how to tell the homing stock from the common rock doves, the set of the body, the brightness of the eye, the way a true homer carried itself with a kind of alert confidence, as if it always knew exactly where it was. The fancy birds her flock had descended from were mongrels now, but the homing blood still ran strong in a good number of them, and those were the ones that mattered. "A homer does not love you," he told her, the first thing he made her understand. "Do not fool yourself. It loves home. The trick of the whole business is making this barn the place it wants to be more than anywhere on earth. You do that, and it will cross 100 miles to get back to it." So they made the barn a home worth crossing miles for. They built proper nesting boxes along the east wall, each one a snug compartment a bird could call its own. They kept fresh water clean and cool. They mixed feed the way Ida remembered: corn, peas, a little wheat, and they fed at the same hour every day, always inside the barn, always with the same low whistle, so the sound itself came to mean safety and plenty. Maren took to it with her father's patience. She sat for hours observing, keeping notes in a little ledger, the way she had once watched him note the behavior of a troublesome clock. She learned each bird. There was Pitch, a dark slate who bullied his way to the feed first every morning. There was Sister, a soft blue hen who had taken to riding on Maren's shoulder. There was the creamy fantail she named Bright, more ornament than athlete, but beautiful enough to forgive it. And there was a small, unremarkable bluish-gray hen with one white wing feather, whom Maren almost overlooked until she noticed that this one, alone among them, was always the first home. Ida noticed too. "That one," he said, pointing. "Watch that one. Speed is not the gift. Plenty of birds fly fast. The gift is wanting home so bad that nothing else exists. She has got it." Maren named her Compass. Once the flock had settled and bonded fully to the loft, Ida showed her how to train them to return from a distance. They started small, almost insultingly small. He had her carry 6 birds in a wicker basket just to the fence line, 100 yards off, and release them. The birds rose, circled once in confusion, then dropped straight back to the barn and their waiting feed. "That is the whole secret," Ida said, watching them go. "Just farther every day, just a little farther." So every clear morning, Maren carried the basket a bit farther down the south road before opening it. A quarter mile. A half mile. A full mile, where she could no longer even see the barn over the swell of the prairie. And every time the birds rose, took their bearing in those first wheeling seconds aloft, and arrowed home. By the time she got back on foot, they were already on the threshing floor, jostling for corn, looking thoroughly pleased with themselves. She could not understand how they did it. Neither could Ida, not really. "Nobody rightly knows," he admitted, scratching his jaw. "Some say they read the sun. Some say they feel the earth itself, like a needle feels north. I just know they do it. You can blindfold a man, spin him around in open country, and he is lost forever. Do the same to one of these little birds, and she will point home like she is pulled there on a string." That mystery only deepened Maren's fascination. She began to send notes. It started as a game. She would tuck a scrap of paper into a tiny quill tied to a bird's leg. 2 miles out, fine morning, releasing now. Time how long until the bird reappeared at the barn, where Ida waited to read it. 3 minutes. 2. Sometimes barely more than 1. The bird, a speck, then a streak, then home. The message in her hand before Maren had walked a quarter of the distance back. She was, without quite realizing it yet, building something. Each bird trained, each mile added, each note carried, was another tooth cut into a great machine whose purpose she could not yet name. She only knew that the work made her happy in a way nothing had since Ohio, and that the barn everyone had called worthless had become somehow the most alive place she knew. Word of the strange business at the Aldous barn got around, the way everything got around in a settlement of 40 families. Most of it was laughter. "Heard you are keeping the rats with wings on purpose now, Miss Vale," said Mr. Pruitt, not unkindly, when she came in for feed corn. "Folks say you sit out there and talk to them." "I do," Maren said. "They are better listeners than most." He chuckled and weighed out her corn and did not charge her full price, which was his way of being fond of someone while pretending not to be. But not everyone laughed. The children especially were enchanted. They started turning up at the barn on Saturdays, first 2, then 5, then a whole ragged delegation, to watch the birds wheel and pour back down to the loft. Maren put them to work. She taught them to fill the water dishes, to whistle the feeding call, to hold a bird gently, both hands cupped, the way you would hold something that mattered. She showed them Compass and the white wing feather that marked her, and the children adopted the little hen as their personal champion, cheering every time she touched down first. It was the children, in the end, who turned the game into something real. A boy named Aldo Reyes, maybe 10 years old and serious as a judge, lived with his family on a claim 4 miles northwest, the farthest flung homestead in the whole settlement. So far out that his mother sometimes went a full week without speaking to another grown soul. Aldo asked one Saturday if he could take a bird home with him. "What for?" Marin asked. "So I could send you a letter," the boy said simply, "without walking 4 miles. Marin and Ider looked at each other. It was so obvious, said so plainly by a child, that they both felt a little foolish for not having said it themselves. That was the thing they had been building. That was the purpose the great machine had been cut for all along. They sent Aldo home with 2 birds in a basket and careful instructions. 3 days later, in the gray of early morning, a bird dropped out of the northwest sky and landed on the barn roof. Tied to its leg was a curl of paper in a child's careful pencil. "Hen's laying good. Ma says hello. The little gray one beat the big one home. Aldo." Marin held that scrap of paper for a long time. A message had crossed 4 miles of empty prairie in under 20 minutes, a distance that took a man on foot the better part of a morning, and a horse a hard half-hour over bad ground. She started thinking then in a way she had not before, not about a game, about a system. She made a list of the families who lived farthest out, the ones most often cut off, most often alone. She thought about Cub Creek, which flooded its low crossing every spring and stranded the western farms for days. She thought about old Mrs. Petrak, who lived alone and whose heart, the doctor said, was not strong. She thought about the long, terrible gaps between something is wrong and help is coming, gaps measured in miles of mud and hours of daylight, gaps in which sometimes people died. Birds did not care about mud. Birds did not care about a washed-out crossing or a lame horse or the dark. A bird went over all of it, straight and fast, pulled home on Ider's invisible string. Over the next week, she gave trained pairs to the families willing to take them. The Reyes place, the Petrak place, 3 farms across the creek, the schoolteacher, and Dr. Hollis himself, who accepted his basket with a skeptical eyebrow and the air of a man humoring a harmless eccentric. To each she gave the same instructions. Keep them fed, keep them dry, and when you have a message for the settlement, tie it small and let them fly. The birds, loyal to the loft where they had been raised, would carry it straight back to Marin's barn. And from there, she or the children could carry word on to wherever it needed to go. It was crude. It only ran one direction, inward. Half the families thought she was wasting good corn on a fancy. Dr. Hollis privately doubted he would ever lose his birds at all. But the network existed now, thin and untested, spread across the settlement like the first faint threads of a web. The barn at the heart of it hummed with 300 wings. Marin stood in the doorway one evening, watching the flock pour home against a pink sky, and felt, for the first time since a hard winter in Ohio had taken everything, that she had found her thread and woven herself firmly into the cloth of a place. She had no idea how soon it would all be tested. The test came sooner than she expected. The rains arrived in the 2nd week of June, sweeping in from the west with a gray determination that seemed older than the sky itself. They began on a Tuesday, a slow drizzle that misted the windows and softened the dust of the south road into a pale mud that sucked at a woman's boots with every step. Marin thought nothing of it. Spring rains were common on the Nebraska prairie, and the farmers welcomed them after a dry May. But this rain did not lift by evening. It settled in, low and heavy, as if the clouds had decided to stay until they had wrung themselves dry. By the 3rd day, the drizzle had thickened into a steady downpour that drummed on the barn roof without pause. The birds grew restless, huddling deeper into their nesting boxes, their usual morning clamor subdued. Marin doubled their feed and checked the roof for leaks, patching a half-dozen places where water had begun to seep through the old shingles. Ider came by on the 4th morning, soaked to the bone, and told her that Cub Creek was already running high, higher than he had seen it in 3 years. "The low crossing will go if this keeps up another day," he said, shaking water from his hat. That road will be cut clean in half." Marin looked out at the gray wall of rain and felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The Western farms, the Reyes place, the Petrak place, 3 others, all depended on that crossing. Without it, they were islands. The rain did not stop. On the 5th day, the wind shifted and the downpour became a deluge, sheets of water driven almost sideways, turning the yard into a shallow lake and sending muddy rivulets coursing down every slope. Marin could not leave the barn. The children did not come. The road to town was a bog. She sat in the loft with compass on her shoulder and listened to the water falling, 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 and tried not to imagine what was happening 4 miles to the northwest. On the 6th morning, the rain slackened for a few hours, and Marin waded into Beatrice to buy supplies. The town was subdued, shutters drawn, the streets empty except for a few men on horseback picking their way through the mire. Mr. Pruitt looked up when she entered the mercantile, his face grim. "Creek is over its banks," he said without greeting. "Low crossing went sometime last night. Gorham tried to get across this morning and had to turn back. Water is running 6 feet deep over the road, and the current is strong enough to take a horse." Marin set down her sack of corn. "The Western farms." "Cut off," Pruitt said flatly. "Dr. Hollis was in here an hour ago looking for a way around. There is none. The southern bridge is 11 miles down, and the river bottoms are flooding too. He cannot get to them, and they cannot get to him." Marin bought her corn and walked home through the mud with the words echoing in her head. Cut off. It was the thing she had feared, the thing she had built her fragile web to guard against. And now it had come, and she was not ready. That evening the rain returned. On the 7th morning, just after dawn, Marin heard a familiar flutter at the barn roof. She looked up to see a small gray shape drop out of the low clouds and land hard on the perch, wings sagging, breast heaving. It was one of Aldo's birds, the little gray hen she had given him, the one he called Runner. The bird was exhausted, mud-spattered, its feathers plastered flat by the rain. But it had come. It had crossed 4 miles of flooded prairie to reach home. Marin's hands shook as she untied the paper from its leg. The message was written in Aldo's careful child's hand, but the letters were pressed so hard that the pencil had nearly torn through the page. "Mrs. Petrak fell down. Cannot wake her. Pa is stuck this side of creek. Can't get to doctor. Please. Aldo." Marin read it twice, her heart dropping through the floor of the world. Old Mrs. Petrak, alone on her homestead with a heart that had been failing for years. Her nearest neighbor was the Reyes family, a mile away, but the creek now lay between them and the doctor. Aldo's father could not cross. No one could cross. But Marin had birds, and Dr. Hollis was 3 miles to the east, on the right side of the flood. She had to tell him. She stood in the threshing floor, the paper clutched in her hand, and the terrible geometry of the situation closed around her like a trap. Her birds flew to her. Every bird she had trained, every bird she had placed with the families, was bonded to this barn. They could carry messages to her from anywhere in the settlement, but they could not carry messages from her to anywhere else. The whole network ran one way, inward, like a spider web that caught flies but could not send the spider out. She had built half a machine. She had never trained a single bird to fly the other direction. The realization hit her like cold water. She stood among her cooing flock with 300 birds at her command, and not one of them could carry a message to Dr. Hollis. To reach him, she would have to do it the old way. Saddle a horse, ride 3 miles east through the mud, and pray that Mrs. Petrak's failing heart could wait the hour it would take. She did not have a horse. The barn had never come with one. For one black moment, Marin Vale stood in the doorway of her worthless barn, watching the rain fall, and felt every neighbor's certainty come roaring back, that she had wasted her money, wasted her months, built a monument to her own foolishness, while a real emergency exposed it for the toy it was. The town had laughed at her birds, and now the town would be proved right. Then Ida's voice came to her from memory, steady and sure. "A homer loves home. Make it a place it wants to be, and it will cross anything to get back." Home. Dr. Hollis's birds thought of this barn as home. But what about a bird that thought of the doctor's loft as home? She stood very still. Weeks ago, when she had first started building the network, Dr. Hollis had given her 2 of his own young birds in trade. Birds he had raised at his own place, birds bonded to his loft. She had accepted them without much thought, planning to integrate them into her flock. But they had never settled. They had fretted and paced for days when they first came, pining for the loft where they had been hatched. She had kept them in a separate box at the far end of the barn, intending to give them back the next time she saw the doctor. And then she had forgotten. They were still there. 2 russet cocks, homesick and restless, wanting nothing in the world more than to fly east 3 miles to the doctor's loft. She had the means to speak. She had had it all along. Marin tore across the barn, scattering startled birds, and threw open the lid of the far nesting box. There they were, huddled together, their russet feathers dull with unhappiness. The calmer of the 2 looked up at her with bright, anxious eyes. She cupped it in both hands, feeling its heart hammer against her fingers, fast as her own, fast as a prayer. "Please," she whispered to it, "please want to go home." She sat down on the threshing floor and wrote the message. Her hands trembled so badly that the pencil slipped twice, and she had to press the paper flat against her knee to steady herself. The words had to be right. They had to be clear. They had to carry the weight of a life. Dr. Hollis, Mrs. Petrak has fallen, cannot wake. Weak heart. Urgent. West farms are cut off, creek crossing gone. You cannot reach her by road. I cannot reach you, but this bird can. Send word back with your barn birds. Tell me what to do. M. Vale, South Barn. She rolled the paper tight and slid it into the tiny quill she had prepared for just such a purpose. She tied it to the russet cock's leg with shaking fingers, double knotting the twine, whispering reassurance to the bird the whole while. Then she carried it to the barn door and lifted it to the gray sky. The rain had slackened to a drizzle. The clouds hung low and ragged, but there was enough light for a bird to find its bearings. Marin opened her hands. The russet cock burst upward, wings beating hard, climbing into the wet air. It circled the barn once, twice, orienting itself, reading the invisible map that only a homer could read. Marin stood with her heart in her throat, because this was the whole gamble, this single creature's longing for a loft 3 miles east. If it turned back to her, if it lost its nerve in the rain, if it simply did not remember the way, she had nothing left. The bird stopped circling. It tilted its wings, caught some line in the air that no human eye could see, and shot away, straight and true, due east, toward Dr. Hollis's place. Marin did not breathe until it vanished into the gray. Then she loosed the second russet an hour later with a copy of the same message, in case the first had failed or fallen. And then she sat on her trunk in the barn doorway, the way she had sat on it that first homeless afternoon, and watched the eastern sky until her eyes ached. The drizzle turned back to rain. The children came, one by one, splashing through the mud. Aldo's younger sister, the schoolteacher's boy, 2 little girls from the crossroads. They had heard about Mrs. Petrak. They had seen Aldo's bird come in. They knew what was at stake. They sat with Marin in silence, their small faces pale and solemn, watching the sky with her. Noon came. No word from the east. The doctor's birds had not returned. Either he had not loosed them, or worse, there had been nothing yet worth sending. Marin tortured herself with the arithmetic. If he had left the instant he got her message, he would be barely halfway to the bridge by now. 11 miles south, then 11 back up the far side. He could not possibly reach the Petrak place before late afternoon at the earliest. And Mrs. Petrak's breathing, Aldo had said, was already strange. She had done everything she could do, and everything she could do might not be enough. And that was the cruelest mathematics of the frontier. That distance killed slowly while you stood helpless in a doorway watching the sky. Ida arrived, soaked from the long walk around the high ground. He read the messages, read Marin's face, and put one big steady hand on her shoulder. "You sent the word," he said quietly. 20 miles of broken country, and you sent it in 3 minutes on the wings of a bird. Everybody told you to burn your barn. Whatever happens now, girl, you did a thing no horse in this county could have done. It did not feel like enough. Mid-afternoon, the rain started again in earnest, thin and cold, driven by a rising wind. Marin imagined the doctor's wagon bogged on a flooded side road. the wheels spinning in mud, the hours slipping away. She pressed her knuckles to her mouth and did not let herself cry, because if she started, she might not stop. Then, near 4 o'clock, with the light already failing under the clouds, the children started shouting all at once. A bird out of the east, dropping fast. It was one of the doctor's russets, mud-flecked, spent, its flight ragged from exhaustion. It landed hard on the perch, wobbling, and Marin had the message off its leg before it had folded its wings. She unrolled the paper with fingers that felt like blocks of wood. The handwriting was a doctor's brisk slant, and the words blurred so badly she had to wipe her eyes to read them. "Got your bird. On the road now, but the bridge 11 miles south is underwater too. Whole bottom is flooded. No way across to West Farms from any direction I know. I am turning back. Tell me there is another road, or she is beyond my reach. Hollis." Marin's hand dropped to her side. There was no other road. She read the doctor's words again, letting them settle into her bones like cold water. "No way across to West Farms from any direction I know. I am turning back. Tell me there is another road, or she is beyond my reach." There was no other road. She knew this country now, every passable inch of it, every washout and cattle track and dry weather shortcut. She had walked and ridden it all, training her birds mile by mile. The low crossing was gone. The southern bridge was drowned. The river bottoms had become a brown inland sea that swallowed the horizon. Dr. Hollis was 3 miles from his patient as the bird flew, and there was no way for a man, a horse, or a wagon to cover those 3 miles at all. She sat down hard on the threshing floor, the paper crumpling in her hand. The rain drummed on the roof. The flock stirred above her, murmuring, oblivious. Eider stood in the doorway, his broad silhouette dark against the gray light, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not be a lie. The children had gone quiet. Little Ruth Reyes, Aldo's sister, had her face pressed against the gap in the barn door, watching the rain as if she could will it to stop. The schoolteacher's boy sat on a sack of feed with his arms wrapped around his knees. No one spoke. Somewhere across the impassable creek, an old woman was slipping away. And the cleverest thing Marin Vale had ever built could do nothing but report it swiftly and uselessly to people who could not move. She had thought the work meant something. She had thought, in her pride, that she had found the answer to the long, deadly distances of this place. But distance had only changed its shape. A message crossed in 3 minutes. What good was that when nobody could follow it? You could not fly a doctor over a flood. You could not tie medicine to a bird's leg, and Marin went very still. The thought arrived not as inspiration, but almost as a rebuke. The old landlady's voice came back to her, the words she had not believed. "A thing's only worthless until somebody figures out what it's good for." She had been thinking of the birds as messengers, carriers of words. But a bird did not know the difference between a word and a weight. It only knew home, and it would carry whatever you tied to it across any flood on earth. The doctor could not reach the patient, but the doctor could reach the patient's symptoms and send back on the wing exactly what was needed. And if the thing needed were small enough, light enough, it could fly the rest of the way itself. She was on her feet before she finished the thought. "Eider!" Her voice came out fierce, cutting through the silence. "How much can one bird carry, truly carry, and still fly straight?" He blinked, startled by the sudden energy in her. "A strong one, short distance, 1/2 an ounce, maybe more." "Why?" "1/2 an ounce." The words tumbled out. "A folded paper of powdered medicine weighs less than that. A doctor's precise written instructions weigh nothing at all. The doctor cannot get to her, but Aldo is across the creek with her, and Aldo has my birds. If Hollis tells us what she needs, and we carry it to her on the wing—" She was already reaching for paper. "We do not need a road." Eider's weathered face went through a slow transformation. Confusion, then understanding, then a dawning wonder that softened the hard lines around his mouth. "Lord," he breathed. "Lord, girl, you might have it." What followed was the fastest hour of Marin Vale's life, and she ran it like her father working the inside of a clock. Every part in its place, every motion sure. First, the question she wrote to the doctor. She wrote it large and clear, the letters pressed hard because her hand was shaking, and she needed them to be legible in whatever dim light he would read them by. Hollis, cannot cross. Understood. But the Reyes boy is with her on the west side, and he has 2 of my birds that fly home to me. Tell us exactly, what are her signs, and what does she need? Write it small. We will carry your medicine to her on the wing. Send everything by your bird. We have light for 1 hour, maybe less. Vale. She tied it to the second russet, the fresher one, the one that had not yet flown today, and carried it to the door. The rain had slackened to a mist, and there was a pale break in the clouds to the east, a silver seam of hope. She lifted the bird, felt its quick heart, and let it go. It climbed, found its line, and was gone. Then she wrote west to Aldo, and this was the hardest letter, because so much rode on the steadiness of a 10-year-old boy. Aldo, be brave and listen close. The doctor cannot cross the water, but you can help him help her. Keep Mrs. Petrak warm and on her side. Watch her breathing and her color. Count her breaths for 1 full minute. Send me what you see on the gray hen now. Then keep my other bird ready. We will fly medicines to you. You can do this. M. She tied it to Sister, the gentle blue hen who had always been her favorite, and sent her northwest into the wind. Now the waiting began again, but this waiting had shape. This was the deliberate pause of a mechanism between strokes, and Marin filled it by readying everything she could ready. She laid out paper, pencil, the smallest quills, twine cut to length. She had the children build up a lantern fire in the doorway, so returning birds could find the barn against the gathering dark. Eider stood at the perch to receive, his big hands steady and ready. The children did not speak. They moved quickly and quietly, understanding without being told that something had shifted, that hope had crept back into the barn on silent wings. Sister came home first. The blue hen dropped out of the mist and landed hard on the perch, her breast heaving. Eider lifted the message off her leg with hands that trembled slightly, the first time Marin had ever seen him tremble. He unrolled the paper and read aloud. She breathes 8 times in a minute, slow and deep and bad. Lips going blue-gray, can't wake her, cold to touch. The little gray one is here and ready, tell me what to do. 8 breaths a minute. Marin did not know what that meant, but she knew who did. She copied the words onto a fresh scrap, writing large and plain, and was still pressing the paper flat when the doctor's russet came home. The bird was mud-soaked and heaving, its wings splayed when it landed. It had flown hard and fast, driven by the urgency it must have felt in the hands that loosed it. Eider caught it gently and untied the message with the care of a man handling spun glass. Dr. Hollis had not waited to be asked twice. His answer was already a diagnosis and a plan, written in the tiny, cramped hand of a man who understood exactly what a half-ounce could carry. Slow breathing plus blue lips, plus cold, plus unwakeable. Her heart is failing, and her body is starving for air. She needs the heart tincture I gave the Petrak family last winter. Small brown bottle, kitchen shelf, labeled Digitalis. The boy must find it. 10 drops under her tongue, no more. Count them. Then sit her up against pillows. Keep her warm. Keep her breathing. I am sending a written dose card. If no bottle in house, send word instantly, and I will fly the powder. Move, Vale. H. The bottle. The bottle was already there, in Mrs. Petrak's kitchen, on the shelf. The medicine that could save her life had been sitting 12 feet from her the whole time. And the only thing missing was the knowing. And the knowing now lived in Marin's hand, and the knowing could fly. She did not waste a breath. She wrote it out for Aldo in the plainest words a frightened boy could follow, pressing the pencil so hard it left grooves in the paper. Aldo, run to the kitchen. Small brown bottle on the shelf says Digitalis on the label. Bring it to her. Put 10 drops under her tongue. Count them out loud, exactly 10, no more. Then sit her up against pillows and keep her warm. The doctor says this is her heart, and this is the medicine for it. Do it now. Send the gray hen back to tell me it is done. You are saving her life. M. She tied it to Compass. The little bluish-gray hen with the one white wing feather sat quiet in her hands, her head cocked, her bright eye fixed on Marin's face as if she understood the weight of this moment. This was the bird Eider had picked out of 300, the one who wanted home more than any of them. The one who was always first home. Compass had never carried a message that mattered before. She had carried games, practice notes, a child's greeting from 4 miles away. She had never carried a life. Maren cupped her in both hands a moment longer, felt the quick, brave heart beating against her palm, and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You have never had a flight that mattered like this one," she whispered. "Go straight, little one. Go home to that boy." She opened her hands. Compass leapt into the mist, wings beating hard. She threw one fast circle around the lantern light, orienting herself, and then she found her line, northwest, straight as a plumb line toward the Reyes place and the old woman who needed her. She dwindled to a speck, to a shadow, to nothing, to faith. And then there was only the fire in the doorway, and the breathing of the flock, and the longest wait of all, the wait at the end of everything, when the work is done and out of your hands, and all that remains is to learn whether it was enough. The children did not speak. Eider stood like a post. The rain hissed in the lantern flame, and the shadows swayed against the barn walls. Maren counted her own breaths to keep from screaming, and lost count and started over. Somewhere out past the drowned creek, a 10-year-old boy was counting drops under an old woman's tongue. 1, 2, 3. His whole small hand steady because a letter had told him he could be. 4, 5, 6. Full dark fell. No bird returned. Maren's certainty began to crack. Too far in the dark. Compass could not fly a strange route by night. No Homer could. She had asked the impossible, and the little hen was down somewhere in the wet grass, and the news would never come, and Mrs. Petrak would die alone in a dark room with a boy who had done everything right except that the messenger had failed. She was about to speak, to say something, anything, to break the silence that was crushing her, when she heard it. A sound on the roof, a flutter, a scrabble, a small, exhausted body folding itself onto the perch. Eider was there before she could move, his huge hands closing gently around the bird, and the white wing feather caught the lantern light, and the paper was there, tied to Compass's leg, still dry because the little hen had tucked it under her wing against the rain. Maren's fingers shook so badly that Eider had to untie it. He unrolled the paper and held it to the firelight, his lips moving silently as he read. Then his voice broke clean down the middle as he spoke the words aloud. Gave her 10 drops. Counted them. Did it twice, over an hour. She woke up. She knows me. She drank some broth and asked why I was crying. Her lips are pink. She is sitting up by the fire. Ma says you are an angel, and the birds are angels. She is alive. Aldo. The barn erupted. The children shrieked and leapt, grabbing each other's hands, spinning in wild circles. Little Ruth Reyes burst into tears and ran to Maren, burying her face in her apron. Eider sat down hard on the threshing floor and wept openly into his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with sobs he did not bother to hide. And Maren Vale stood in the doorway of her worthless barn with 300 pigeons stirring above her and a scrap of paper pressed to her heart. And she laughed and cried at the same time, because the distance had not won. The distance had not won. Morning came clear and cold, the clouds broken at last, and the prairie emerged from the flood like a creature rising from a long sleep. The water had begun to recede, leaving behind a landscape of mud and debris, fallen fences, and trees stripped of their lower branches. Cub Creek still ran high and dangerous, but the rain had stopped, and the sun, pale and tentative, picked out the silver strands of light between the last ragged clouds. Maren stood in the barn doorway and watched the world dry. She had not slept. Her eyes felt like they had been rubbed with sand, and her hands still trembled when she thought about the night before. But Compass was perched on her shoulder, preening her feathers as if she had done nothing more remarkable than fly to the fence line and back. And the barn was full of the soft, contented murmur of 300 birds who had no idea they had changed everything. Dr. Hollis arrived before the dew had burned off the grass. He came on foot, leading his horse, which had thrown a shoe somewhere in the mud. His boots were caked to the knee, His coat splattered, and his face wore an expression that Marin had never seen on it before, something between exhaustion and awe. He stopped a few paces from the barn door and looked at her, looked at the birds milling in the loft, looked at Compass on her shoulder. Then he took off his hat and held it against his chest. "Miss Vale," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion, "I owe you an apology, and I owe you more gratitude than I know how to put into words." Marin shook her head. "It was the birds. I just wrote the letters. It was the birds because you made them what they are." He stepped closer, and she saw that his eyes were red-rimmed. "I examined Mrs. Petrak this morning. I crossed the creek at first light on a horse I borrowed from the Reyes place. She is weak, but she is alive. She is sitting up. She is eating broth. If that boy had not gotten the tincture into her when he did—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Another hour, and I would have been too late." The distance would have won. A great shudder ran through Marin, the accumulated strain of the past 2 days finally breaking loose. She leaned against the doorframe and pressed her hand to her mouth. Compass cooed softly and nudged her ear. "The birds," Hollis continued, his voice quiet but firm, "carried the diagnosis to me, the instructions to the boy, the confirmation back to you. In less time than it would have taken a man on horseback to travel a single mile of good road. I have been a physician for 23 years, and I have never seen anything like it." He looked up at the rafters, where the pigeons were beginning to stir in the morning light. "I told myself they were a fancy, a harmless eccentricity. I took your birds because you asked nicely, and I did not believe they would ever matter." He met her eyes again. "I was wrong, and I am telling you now publicly that I was wrong." Marin did not know what to say. She stood in the doorway of her barn, a plain woman in a patched dress, covered in bird dust and exhaustion, and a man she respected was telling her she had been right all along. It felt like a dream, the kind that slips away when you open your eyes. But it was not a dream. The doctor shook her hand firmly and warmly, and then he walked back to his horse and began the slow journey home. And the news spread, as news always spreads in a settlement of 40 families, carried by children and wagons, and the simple fact that there was no such thing as a secret on the prairie. By noon, people began to arrive at the barn. First came the Reyes family. Aldo ran ahead, his boots splashing through the last of the puddles, and he threw himself at Marin before she could brace herself, wrapping his thin arms around her waist. "I counted them," he said into her apron, his voice muffled but fierce. "I counted every single one. I did it right." "Of course you did," Marin said, and she held him tight. "I knew you would." His mother came up behind him, a worn woman with kind eyes and a face that remembered hardship. She took Marin's hands in both of hers and squeezed them without speaking. The gratitude in the gesture was deeper than words. Then came the schoolteacher, bringing a basket of eggs. Then the miller's wife, with a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. Then Mr. Pruitt, who had closed the mercantile for an hour, an act so unprecedented that it spoke louder than any compliment. He stood in the barn, looked at the pigeons with new eyes, and said, "I suppose you will be wanting more corn now." "I suppose I will," Marin said. He nodded, and she thought she saw the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "I will sell it to you at cost, for a while at least." The afternoon brought more visitors, each one with a question. Could they have a pair of birds? Did Marin have enough to spare? What did it take to keep them? How did one train a homer? She answered as best she could, her voice hoarse from talking, her head spinning with the sudden shift in the town's regard. The barn that had been a laughingstock was now a destination. The birds that had been vermin were now a lifeline. Eider came by late in the day, his own work at the mill finished. He found Marin sitting on a feed sack, Compass in her lap. A small crowd of children gathered around her, and he smiled a long, slow smile. "You have done it," he said. "The whole settlement knows now. They saw the difference." "They saw one old woman saved," Marin said. "That is not the same as understanding what the birds can do. It is a beginning. People remember what saves them. But not everyone remembered kindly." Word of the doctor's apology and Mrs. Petrak's rescue reached the ears of Cyrus Hempstead by sundown, and the effect was not what Marin might have hoped. Cyrus Hempstead was a man of substance. He owned the largest farm in the county, a sprawling operation of 200 acres with a barn that could hold 50 head of cattle. He had come to Nebraska 20 years before Marin was born, had weathered blizzards and droughts and grasshoppers, and he had done it all without the help of fancy homing pigeons and a girl who talks to birds. He was a bluff, red-faced man with a voice that carried across a field without effort, and he did not believe in novelties. He appeared at the barn the following morning, riding a fine bay mare that he pulled up short just outside the door. He did not dismount. He looked down at Marin from the saddle, his thick arms crossed over the pommel, and he said, "I hear you have been playing messenger girl." Marin had met Cyrus Hempstead twice before. Both times he had spoken to her as if she were a child who had wandered into a conversation she did not understand. She straightened her back and met his gaze. "I sent a message to Dr. Hollis, yes, and he sent back instructions, and the medicine got where it needed to go. So I am told." He shifted in his saddle, and his tone carried a weight of skepticism that had been hardened by years of certainty. "Let me tell you what I think, Miss Vale. I think that old woman was lucky. I think your birds are a distraction from real work, and I think that if you spend your time chasing fancy ideas instead of putting in a proper crop and raising decent stock, you will be broke and gone by the end of next summer." Marin did not flinch. She had faced worse than Cyrus Hempstead in the past year. She had faced empty pockets and a leaking roof, and 300 birds looking down at her in the dark. One man's dismissal did not frighten her. "Mr. Hempstead," she said, keeping her voice level, "I did not ask for your approval. I did not ask for your advice. I am doing what I believe in, and this barn is feeding itself and serving the settlement. If you think that is foolish, you are welcome to your opinion." He stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he laughed, a short, sharp laugh that was meant to dismiss her, but sounded forced. "You have got grit, I will give you that. But grit does not fill a belly or pay a debt. You keep your birds, girl, I will keep my cattle, and we will see who is still standing come winter." He wheeled his horse and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and the echo of his laughter hanging in the air. The children who had gathered to watch the exchange looked at Marin with wide eyes. Little Ruth Reyes tugged at her sleeve. "He is mean," she said. "Do not listen to him." Marin put a hand on the girl's head. "He is afraid," she said quietly. "People who are certain of everything are often the most afraid of change. He does not understand what I am building here, and that frightens him, so he tries to tear it down with words." "But you will keep building," Ruth said. It was not a question. "Yes," Marin said, "I will keep building." And she did. The days that followed were a blur of work, each morning bringing new tasks and new challenges. The flood had left behind a layer of debris that had to be cleared. The barn needed more nesting boxes, more perches, more space for the growing number of birds. Families who had seen the value of the network wanted their own pairs, and Marin spent hours teaching them the basics of care and training. Eider helped when he could, his quiet wisdom grounding the enterprise. Word continued to spread. Dr. Hollis became an unexpected advocate, mentioning the pigeons to every patient who would listen. He wrote a letter to the county seat, describing the network and its potential. A farmer from 20 miles away wrote in to ask about buying birds. Marin began to keep a ledger of requests, a careful list of who had been trained, who had birds, who was reliable. But the shadow of Cyrus Hempstead lingered. He was a man of influence, and his skepticism carried weight. Some families who had shown interest grew hesitant. "Old Hempstead says it is a fool's errand," the blacksmith Gorham told Marin when she stopped by for wire. "He says a well-trained horse is worth 100 pigeons. He says you cannot eat a bird's message when the winter stores run low." "He is not wrong about the horse," Marin said, "but a horse cannot cross a flooded creek in 3 minutes." Gorham shrugged. "I am not saying I agree with him. I am saying he talks, and people listen." Marin went home that evening with a weight on her chest. She had built something real, something that had saved a life. But the doubt of one man had the power to slow her progress, to make the wary hesitate, to keep her network small and fragile when it needed to grow. She was sitting in the loft as dusk fell, Compass and sister perched on the beam beside her, when Eider came up the ladder. He did not speak at first. He sat down across from her, his legs dangling over the edge, and watched the birds settle for the night. "He is afraid," Eider said finally. "I know. Afraid men do not listen to reason, they only listen to evidence." He looked at her, his dark eyes steady in the fading light. "You have given them one piece of evidence. One saved life. But one saved life can be called luck. Two can be called a coincidence. Three is a pattern. How am I supposed to produce three? I cannot control when people get sick or injured. You cannot, but you can be ready. You can be visible. You can let the network grow until it becomes a part of the settlement's bones. And when the next crisis comes, and it will come, you will be there." He paused. "And then even Cyrus Hempstead will have to see." Maren turned his words over in her mind. She thought about the long summer ahead, the harvest season, the inevitable accidents and emergencies that a frontier community faced. She thought about all the families who lived beyond the easy reach of town, the ones who waited too long to send for help because the journey was too hard. She thought about the winter that would follow, when snow could cut off a homestead for weeks. She was building for those moments. Every bird she trained, every family she taught, every mile of distance she shrank with feathers and instinct. It was all preparation for a future she could not predict but refused to ignore. "I will be ready," she said. Eider nodded. "I know you will." The weeks passed into July, and the prairie turned golden under a sun that knew no mercy. The flood was a memory. The ground baked hard, and the creek shrank back to its lazy summer self. Maren's barn became a quiet hub of activity, a place where children came to learn, and adults came to ask questions, and the birds came home every evening in a thunder of wings. She trained 3 new pairs for families on the far side of the settlement. She worked with Dr. Hollis to establish a regular schedule. He would keep a small loft of barn-raised birds at his place, and she would keep a similar loft at hers, so that messages could fly in both directions without relying on borrowed birds. It was a small improvement, but it doubled the speed of communication. And still Cyrus Hempstead watched from a distance, his skepticism undimmed. He made no secret of his opinion. He told anyone who would listen that Maren Vale was a girl playing with toys while her land lay fallow. He pointed out that she had not planted a single row of corn, that her barn was full of pigeons instead of livestock, that she was a curiosity and nothing more. The whispers reached Maren's ears, carried by well-meaning neighbors who thought she should know. She listened, thanked them, and went back to her work. She had stopped trying to convince the convinced. Let them talk. The birds did not care, and neither would she. Then, on the last Saturday of July, while the children were gathered in the barn for their weekly lesson, a rider came galloping up the south road in a cloud of dust. It was a young man named Emmett Cross, who worked as a hired hand on Cyrus Hempstead's farm. His face was pale, his shirt soaked with sweat, and he swung off his horse before it had fully stopped. "Miss Vale," he gasped, "Mr. Hempstead's best milk cow is gone missing. She wandered off 3 days ago, and we have searched every draw and hollow within 5 miles. If she is not found soon, she will die out there. The boss says she is worth more than his whole spring calf crop. He is frantic." Maren looked at him calmly. "Then why have you come to me?" Emmett Cross looked down at his boots. "He would never admit it," he said quietly. "But I heard about your birds. I heard about Mrs. Petrak. I thought, if you could send a message to a doctor, maybe you could send a message to find a cow." The children were watching, their eyes wide. Eider had come to stand in the doorway, his arms crossed, a faint smile touching his lips. Maren considered the request. She had never thought of using the birds for search work. A cow was not a person, and the stakes were different. But the principle was the same. Distance could be defeated by wings. "Bring me something that belongs to the cow," she said. "A halter, a length of rope she has worn, something that carries her scent." Emmett nodded and rode off. He returned within the hour with a frayed halter looped over his saddle. Maren took it, brought it to the loft, and let the birds examine it. Then she selected 6 of her strongest homers, Pitch among them, the bold gray who bullied his way to the feed first every morning, and released them in the direction of the Hempstead spread. She watched them climb and fan out, riding the thermals, reading the land below with eyes that saw what no human eye could see. She did not expect them to find the cow directly. That was not how homers worked, but she hoped that their presence, their constant circling and returning, would draw attention to any place where the cow might be sheltering. It was a gamble, a long shot, a folly, the same words the town had used about her barn. The birds returned at dusk, one by one, settling into the loft with empty legs and no message. But Pitch came back last, and when he landed, he was agitated, flapping his wings and turning in circles, pointing again and again toward the northwest corner of the Hempstead property. "Take me there," Marin said to Emmett. They rode out at dawn, Eider following on a borrowed mule. Pitch flew ahead, circling and returning, leading them past the Hempstead barn, past a long slope of pasture, down into a dry ravine choked with brush. And there, at the bottom, where a seep of water had kept the ground damp, stood the missing cow, her leg caught in a tangle of roots, too weak to pull free. Emmett whooped. He slid down the ravine, cut the roots, and helped the cow to her feet. She was thin and thirsty, but alive. When Cyrus Hempstead heard what had happened, he did not come to thank Marin. He did not send a message. But the next day, a sack of feed corn appeared on her doorstep, with no note and no name attached. It was not an apology. It was not an acknowledgement. But it was something, and Eider picked up the sack with a grunt and said, "That man just paid you in corn. He would not do that if he still thought you were a fool." Marin hoisted the sack onto her shoulder and carried it into the barn. The birds stirred and cooed. Compass landed on her head and pecked gently at her hair. She had made a crack in the wall of certainty, and the crack was enough. The sack of feed corn sat in the corner of the barn for 3 days before Marin finally opened it. She poured the golden kernels into her storage bin, running her fingers through the grain, feeling its weight and substance. It was not an apology. It was not an acknowledgement, but it was a payment. And in the language of the frontier, a payment carried its own kind of respect. Cyrus Hempstead did not speak to her directly. He did not nod when he passed her on the road. But the hired man Emmett Cross began stopping by the barn on his way home from town, asking questions about the birds in a low, almost embarrassed voice. "The boss does not want me asking," he said, "but I saw what those birds did. I want to know how it works." Marin taught him. She showed him how to hold a bird, how to recognize the signs of exhaustion, how to mix the feed. Emmett was a quiet student, patient and careful, and by the end of August he had trained 2 birds of his own, keeping them in a small coop behind the Hempstead bunkhouse. The boss did not know about them, or if he did, he chose not to acknowledge it. The summer wore on, hot and dry, and the prairie turned a shade of brown that promised a hard autumn. The creek shrank to a trickle, and the grass crackled underfoot. Marin's well held, barely, and she carried water to the barn in buckets twice a day, making sure the birds had what they needed. The flock had grown to nearly 400 now, with new chicks hatched in the nesting boxes she had built in the spring. Compass had raised 2 young hens, both marked with the same white wing feather, and they followed their mother with a devotion that made Marin smile every time she saw it. But the drought was only the beginning. In September, a traveling merchant stopped at the mercantile and brought news that sent a shudder through the settlement. An outbreak of something called Texas fever had been spreading through cattle herds further south. It was a tick-borne disease, deadly to northern herds that had never been exposed. The merchant said it had already wiped out 3 ranches in Kansas, and it was moving north. Cyrus Hempstead laughed when he heard the news. "Texas fever is a southern problem," he declared at the general store, loud enough for everyone to hear. "My herd is pure Hereford, raised on Nebraska grass. They are hardy, they are healthy. No tick is going to trouble them." Dr. Hollis was not so sure. He stopped by Marin's barn a few days later, his face drawn. "I have read about Texas fever," he said. "It is carried by ticks that drop off southern cattle and infest the grass. Northern herds have no resistance. If it reaches us, it could move through the settlement like fire through dry grass." "Can it be treated?" Marin asked. "Not once it takes hold. The only prevention is keeping the herd separate and watching for signs. Fever, drooping head, red urine." If a cow shows those, it is already too late." He paused. "The nearest veterinarian is in Omaha, a week's ride away. By the time he could get here, the damage would be done." Marin looked at her birds, perched quietly on the rafters, and felt the familiar weight of helplessness settling on her shoulders. Her network could carry words, but words could not stop a disease. "We will watch," she said, "and if the fever comes, we will spread the warning faster than it can spread itself." October came, cool and dry, and the first reports of Texas fever reached the settlement. A farmer 12 miles south had lost 7 head in a single week. The ticks were moving north, carried by deer and stray cattle, and no one knew how to stop them. Cyrus Hempstead remained defiant. He had his men salt the feeding grounds and burn the pasture edges, hoping to create a barrier of ash that the ticks could not cross. But the ticks were not stopped by ash, and the deer paid no mind to boundaries drawn by men. The first case appeared on the Hempstead spread on the morning of October 12th. Emmett Cross rode into Marin's yard at a gallop, his face ashen. "The boss's best bull is down," he said. "Fever, red urine, the whole thing. He has got it." Marin was already reaching for paper. "Tell me everything. Where is the bull? Has it been separated? How many other cattle have been near it?" Emmett gave her the information, and she wrote it down, then sent a bird to Dr. Hollis and another to the county seat, where someone might know what could be done. The birds flew, and she waited. But the bull died that afternoon, and by the end of the week, 12 more head had fallen sick on the Hempstead spread. Cyrus Hempstead's certainty crumbled into panic. He hired extra men to bury the carcasses deep, burned the bedding in the barn, and still the fever spread. It leaped the boundary of his land and appeared on a farm 3 miles east, then on another. The settlement was facing a catastrophe. Marin's barn became the command post. Every day birds arrived from every corner of the county, carrying reports of new cases, requests for advice, desperate pleas for help. She copied the messages, organized them, and sent responses out on fresh birds. She worked from dawn until well past dark, her hands stained with ink, her voice hoarse from dictating replies to the children who helped her. Dr. Hollis rode from farm to farm, treating what he could, but there was no cure. The only hope was containment, isolating sick animals, burning contaminated ground, keeping the herds separated. But the ticks were everywhere, invisible and patient, and the cattle kept dying. Cyrus Hempstead came to the barn on the 3rd week of the outbreak. He did not ride up proud and loud this time. He came on foot, his fine boots mud-caked, his face haggard. He had lost 40 head. His remaining herd was weak and thinning. He stood in the doorway of the barn and looked at the birds without speaking for a long time. "Miss Vale," he said finally, and his voice was rough, "I have come to ask for your help." Marin did not gloat. She did not remind him of what he had said. She simply nodded and asked, "What do you need?" "I need your birds to carry word to every farm within 20 miles. I need them to tell every rancher what I have learned the hard way, that the fever is here, that isolation is the only defense, that they must burn the grass where sick animals have stood." He stopped, swallowed hard. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about the birds. I am saying it now, plainly, for anyone who cares to hear." The words hung in the air. The children in the barn had gone silent. Eider stood in the shadows, his face unreadable. Marin looked at Cyrus Hempstead, a man who had spent months dismissing her, laughing at her, telling the town she was a fool. And now he stood before her, humbled by a disease that did not care about pride or certainty or the size of a man's herd. "I will send the birds," she said, "and I will keep sending them until this is over." He nodded, turned, and walked away without another word. By nightfall, 20 birds had gone out in every direction, carrying warnings and instructions written in Marin's hand. They flew over pastures where cattle stood with drooping heads, over farms where families waited in fear, over the long brown prairie that stretched to every horizon. And they came home, one by one, bringing answers and questions and the steady reassurance that the network was holding. The fever did not stop. It could not be stopped by wings alone, but the warnings slowed its spread. The settlement began to organize itself, sharing information, coordinating burnings, isolating the sick. But the winter was coming, and the fever had taken too much. The first snow fell on the first day of November, a thin dusting that melted by midday. The second snow, a week later, did not melt. It piled against the barn walls and drifted over the roads, and the temperature dropped to a level that Maren had never experienced. The birds huddled together in the loft, their feathers fluffed against the cold, and Maren spent her days hauling feed and water, keeping the nesting boxes clean, making sure the flock survived. The settlement was battered. The fever had killed nearly a third of the cattle in the county. Families that had relied on their herds for winter income faced ruin. The store ran low on supplies. Dr. Hollis was exhausted, and Mrs. Petrak's health had faltered again, weakened by the summer's ordeal. And the winter was only beginning. One morning, in the middle of a blizzard that howled across the prairie like a living thing, a bird arrived from the county seat. It was a bird Maren had trained and given to the telegraph operator there, a gift meant to connect the settlement to the larger world. The bird was half frozen, its feathers crusted with ice, and it collapsed on the perch the moment it landed. Maren lifted it gently and untied the message. The paper was stiff with cold, and she had to warm it in her hands before she could read the words. Railroad depot reports supply train delayed indefinitely. Snow has blocked the line 40 miles east. No telling when it will get through. County grain stores are low. Suggest all families ration what they have and prepare for a long winter. We'll send word when the line opens. Telegraph office. Maren read the message twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She looked out at the white world beyond the barn door, where the snow fell in a relentless curtain and the wind screamed like a living thing. The settlement was isolated. The supply train was not coming, and the winter had barely begun. She turned to the loft, where 400 birds sat quiet in the dim light, their eyes bright, their bodies warm. She had built a network that could carry words across any distance. But words could not feed a hungry family. She was going to need a different kind of answer. And she had only a few hours of daylight to find it. The blizzard howled for 3 days without mercy. Snow piled against the barn walls until the door could barely swing open, and Maren had to dig a path each morning just to reach the woodpile. The birds huddled together in the loft, their feathers fluffed, their voices reduced to soft murmurs. She fed them twice a day, stretching the corn as far as it would go, and she rationed her own meals to a single bowl of porridge and a heel of bread. By the fourth morning, the settlement was in dire straits. Emmett Cross came through the drifts on foot, his face wind-burned, to report that Cyrus Hempstead's remaining cattle were dying of cold and hunger. The fever had weakened them, and the snow had buried the last of the grays. He had lost half of what was left. The boss says if we do not get food soon, we will be eating boiled leather by Christmas. Dr. Hollis arrived that afternoon, his beard crusted with ice, his horse stumbling with exhaustion. I have visited every family within 5 miles, he said, collapsing onto a sack of feed. The Petrak place has 3 days of flour left. The Reyes family is down to a sack of beans and a slab of salt pork. The schoolteacher has nothing but a jar of pickled eggs. We are facing starvation, Maren. She stood in the center of the barn, the lantern casting long shadows across the threshing floor, and she felt the weight of 400 lives pressing down on her. She had built a network that could carry words, but words could not fill an empty belly. She had trained birds to cross floods and prairies, but they could not carry enough weight to feed a single child. Or could they? The thought came slowly, like a shape emerging from fog. She remembered the search for Hempstead's cow, how Pitch had led them to the ravine. She remembered how the birds could read the land from above, spotting what no human eye could see. There were deer in these hills, antelope, maybe even a stray buffalo that had wandered north. The animals were out there somewhere, hidden in the draws and coulees where the snow did not drift so deep. The birds could find them. "Eider," she said, her voice quiet but sharp. "Do you still have that old rifle? The one you used to hunt with back in Maryland?" He looked at her, and understanding dawned slowly across his weathered face. "I do. It is rusted, but it will fire. Clean it. We are going hunting." The plan was simple, and it was desperate. Maren would release pairs of birds at dawn, sending them out in different directions. They would circle, scout, and return. If they came back agitated, Pointing in a particular direction with that special urgency she had learned to read, she would follow. The birds would find the game, and the men would shoot it. She chose Compass and Pitch for the first flight. Compass for her unerring sense of home, Pitch for his boldness and his keen eye. She carried them to the door, whispered a prayer against their feathers, and let them go into the gray dawn. They rose and split, Compass heading northwest, Pitch due west. Marin watched them dwindle against the snow-heavy sky, and then she waited. An hour passed. She built up the fire and paced the barn floor. The children arrived, wrapped in every coat they owned, their faces pinched with cold and hunger. They gathered around her without speaking, understanding that something important was happening. Compass returned first. She dropped out of the sky like a stone, landed on Marin's shoulder, and immediately began turning her head and cooing, pointing with her beak toward the northwest. She hopped from shoulder to wrist, stretching her neck, impatient. Marin felt the hair on her arms stand up. She had seen this behavior before, when Compass had located a lost chick that had fallen from a nest. "Get Eider," she said, "and tell Emmett to bring a horse." They rode out within the hour, a small party. Marin on a borrowed mare, Eider with the old rifle across his saddle, Emmett leading a pack mule. Compass flew ahead, circling and returning, leading them through the drifts. The snow was deep, and the horses struggled, but Compass never hesitated. She led them northwest, across a frozen creek, up a long rise, and down into a sheltered valley where the wind had stripped the snow from the grass. And there, huddled in the lee of a limestone outcrop, was a herd of antelope. 23 of them, thin but alive, pawing at the exposed grass. Eider dismounted without a word. He checked the rifle, took a long breath, and raised it to his shoulder. The shot echoed across the valley. By nightfall, the settlement had meat. The antelope were dressed and distributed, each family receiving a share. The children who had been listless with hunger ate roasted venison around Marin's fire, their cheeks flushing with color, their laughter returning. The barn smelled of smoke and fat and warmth, and the birds perched in the shadows, cooing softly, as if they knew what they had done. The hunt continued for the next week. Every day, Marin sent out her birds. Every day, they returned with directions, leading the hunters to deer, to antelope, to a pair of wild hogs that had wandered into a brushy draw. The meat was salted and smoked, the hides were tanned, the settlement survived, and the word spread. The birds that had been dismissed as vermin, as toys, as a foolish girl's fancy, had become the difference between life and death. No one laughed anymore, no one doubted. On the last day of November, when the sky cleared and the temperature dropped to a bitter cold, Cyrus Hempstead came to the barn. He walked slowly through the snow, his shoulders bent, his face drawn. He did not stop at the door. He walked inside, past the children, past Eider, past Dr. Hollis, and stood before Marin Vale. He removed his hat. "Miss Vale," he said, and his voice cracked, "I have come to tell you that I was wrong. I was wrong about your birds. I was wrong about you. I was wrong when I said you were wasting your time. You have saved this settlement. You have saved my family. And I am ashamed that it took me so long to see it." He held out his hand. Marin took it. His grip was warm and firm, and she looked into his eyes and saw no pride, no defiance, only the quiet gratitude of a man who had been stripped of his certainty and was better for it. "Thank you, Mr. Hempstead," she said. "That means more than you know." He nodded, released her hand, and turned to go. At the door, he paused. "If you ever need anything at all, you send word. I will be there." He walked out into the snow. Marin turned back to her barn, to her birds, to the children who were waiting for their lesson. Compass fluttered down from the rafters and landed on the feed bin, her white wing feather gleaming in the lantern light. Marin crossed to her, cupped her gently, and lifted her to her cheek. She had been told a lifetime ago that the barn was worthless, that the birds were vermin, that she was a fool to keep them. But she had watched, she had learned, she had refused to look away. And now, on a cold winter evening, with the fire crackling and the full bellies sleeping nearby, Marin Vale reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of hardtack. She broke it in two. One half she placed on the feed bin for Compass. The other she raised to her own lips. They ate together, woman and bird in the warm, golden light of the barn. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.